The hospital room existed in a world separate from everything I had known before. Soft blue light glowed from the monitors surrounding my son's incubator, casting shadows that moved with each beep and hum. My newborn baby boy weighed barely 2 pounds, his chest rising and falling only because a ventilator forced air into his underdeveloped lungs. Each breath he took wasn't really his own yet. The tubes running from his tiny body looked too big, too invasive, too wrong. In the bed beside me, my wife Sarah lay recovering from an emergency cesarean section that had come 8 weeks too early. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow from exhaustion and fear. We had been living in this room for 5 straight days and nights, holding each other through waves of terror, whispering promises we weren't sure we could keep. Then our landlord knocked on the door. When I saw him standing in the doorway, I felt confused for a moment. His name was Richard Chin, and he owned the small duplex we had been renting for 3 years. He looked neat and composed, dressed in a button-down shirt and khakis, completely out of place among the exhausted parents and medical staff that filled the NICU floor. In his hand, he held a bright greeting card decorated with cheerful teddy bears and pastel balloons. The words, "Get well soon," were printed across the front in loopy letters. His smile was brief and practiced, the kind you give when social courtesy demands it but genuine warmth is absent. For one strange second, I thought he had come to offer kindness during the worst week of our lives. I actually felt grateful that someone outside our immediate family cared enough to visit. I stood up from the plastic chair I had been sitting in for hours and walked toward him. My legs felt stiff and unsteady. Sarah stirred slightly in her bed but didn't fully wake. I didn't want to disturb her rest, so I stepped into the hallway to greet him properly. Richard extended the card toward me with both hands, like it was something precious. "I heard about the baby," he said quietly. "I wanted to stop by and give you this." His voice was calm, almost gentle. I thanked him automatically, too drained to think much beyond basic politeness. Maybe exhaustion made me hopeful. Maybe part of me desperately wanted to believe that someone who held power over our housing had come with compassion instead of demands. I accepted the card and told him I appreciated the gesture. He left quickly after that, giving a small nod before disappearing down the hospital corridor. I stood alone in the fluorescent-lit hallway, still holding the card. Around me, nurses moved between rooms, medical equipment rolled past on squeaky wheels, and somewhere down the hall, another baby cried. I turned the card over in my hands, noticing how expensive it looked, how carefully chosen. For a moment, I felt a tiny bit of relief. Maybe things wouldn't be as bad as I feared. Maybe people were kinder than my anxiety suggested. I opened the card slowly, expecting to find a handwritten message of support or encouragement. Instead, I watched a folded piece of paper slip out from between the printed teddy bears and fall toward the floor. I caught the paper before it hit the ground and unfolded it carefully. My eyes scanned the first line, then the second, then jumped to the bold text at the top. It was a 30-day notice to vacate the premises. An eviction notice. Not a message of support. Not a kind gesture. A legal document terminating our lease, hidden inside a baby card while our newborn son fought to stay alive 3 rooms away. I read it twice, then 3 times, unable to fully process what I was seeing. The words blurred together as my hands started shaking. This couldn't be real. Nobody would do something this cruel. But the paper in my hands was real, the letterhead was official, and the signature at the bottom was definitely Richard's. I stood frozen in that hallway for what felt like an hour but was probably only 2 minutes. Other people walked past me, but I didn't see them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, but I didn't hear them. All I could think about was the fact that Richard Chin had known exactly what we were going through. I had called him 3 weeks earlier, back when Sarah first went into early labor and the medical bills started piling up faster than I could count them. I had explained everything on the phone. The premature birth, the NICU stay, the emergency procedures, the fact that I couldn't work because I needed to be at the hospital. I had asked for patience with the rent, promised I would catch up as soon as possible, begged him to understand that we were in crisis mode. He had sounded understanding during that phone call. He said he knew things were difficult. He told me to focus on my family and that we would figure out the money situation later. Those were his exact words, "Focus on your family." I had believed him. I had trusted that basic human decency would prevent him from making our situation worse while our son's life hung in the balance. But now, standing in that hospital hallway with the eviction notice trembling in my hands, I realized he had been planning this the entire time. He had listened to my desperate explanation, made comforting sounds, and then decided the best moment to strike would be when I was at my absolute weakest. I walked back into the hospital room slowly, carefully folding the notice and sliding it into my pocket before Sarah could see it. She was awake now, sitting up slightly in her bed, her eyes fixed on our son's incubator. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. Her voice sounded rough and tired. I told her it was Richard, that he had stopped by to drop off a card. I didn't mention the eviction notice. She had enough to worry about. We both did. I sat back down in my chair, positioned between Sarah's bed and our son's incubator, and stared at the monitors tracking his heart rate, oxygen levels, and breathing patterns. The numbers flickered and changed, little green digits that represented everything we cared about in the world. The shock I felt in the hallway began changing into something else as the hours passed. First came disbelief, a desperate hope that I had misread the notice or misunderstood its meaning. Then came anger, hot and violent, making my jaw clench and my fists tighten until my knuckles turned white. But anger alone wouldn't help us. Screaming wouldn't change anything. Breaking down wouldn't protect my family. So the anger transformed again, hardening into something quieter and sharper. Resolve. Cold, patient, determined resolve. I couldn't control the machines keeping my son alive. I couldn't erase Sarah's pain or make the NICU disappear. But I could refuse to let Richard Chin destroy us when we were already broken. That night, while the NICU hummed its endless mechanical song and sleep refused to come despite my exhaustion, I sat beside my son's incubator with my phone in my hand. The room was dark except for the blue glow of the monitors and the small light above the incubator. Sarah had finally fallen into a restless sleep, her breathing shallow but steady. I stared at our baby's tiny chest rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm, and something inside me shifted completely. I was done feeling helpless. I was done waiting for other people to show mercy. If Richard wanted to weaponize our crisis against us, then I would find out everything I could about him and his business practices. I started with simple searches on my phone, typing his name into Google along with words like landlord, properties, and violations. What came back surprised me. Richard Chin owned not just our duplex, but at least 6 other rental properties scattered across the city. Some were single-family homes, others were small apartment buildings. I clicked through property records, tax assessment websites, and public databases that listed ownership information. Each search led to another link, another document, another piece of the puzzle. I saved everything to my phone, creating folders and screenshots, building a digital trail I could follow later. The NICU was quiet around me except for the soft beeping of monitors and the occasional footsteps of night shift nurses checking on patients. As I dug deeper into public records, a pattern started emerging that made my stomach turn. Several of Richard's properties had code violations attached to them, some dating back 3 or 4 years. I found reports of faulty wiring, broken heating systems, water damage that had never been properly repaired, and structural issues that should have been addressed immediately. One building had been cited for having no valid certificate of occupancy, meaning people were living there illegally while Richard collected rent. Another property had multiple complaints from tenants about mold and pest infestations that he had ignored. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't just neglect. This was a deliberate pattern of extracting money from vulnerable people while providing the bare minimum in return. I discovered that Richard had a habit of avoiding proper permits and inspections. Renovations that legally required city approval had been done without any official paperwork. Rental units that needed safety certifications were being occupied anyway. I found tenant complaints filed with the City Housing Authority, most of them describing the same issues: requests for repairs ignored, security deposits never returned, threats of eviction when people demanded their legal rights. The complaints painted a picture of a landlord who treated tenants as disposable, who used the threat of homelessness to keep people quiet and compliant. Reading these reports at 2 in the morning, sitting in a plastic hospital chair while my son struggled to breathe, I realized Richard had been doing this for years. But what caught my attention most were the financial irregularities I started noticing. Some properties showed rental income on tax filings that seemed suspiciously low compared to market rates. Other properties had no reported rental income at all, despite clearly being occupied based on utility records and tenant complaints. I wasn't an accountant or a lawyer, but even I could see that something didn't add up. It looked like Richard was collecting cash rent from some tenants and never reporting it as income, potentially committing tax evasion on a scale that involved multiple properties and years of unreported earnings. Every detail I uncovered felt like a small piece of armor I could use to protect my family. I knew that anger and suspicion wouldn't be enough. If I wanted to fight back effectively, I needed documentation, facts, and evidence that could withstand scrutiny. So I started organizing everything I found into careful notes. I created a timeline showing when violations were reported and how long they went unaddressed. I made lists of properties with their addresses, tax identification numbers, and documented problems. I saved links to public records, took screenshots of housing authority complaints, and downloaded PDF copies of violation notices that were available online. I worked methodically, double-checking every detail, making sure I could support every claim with verifiable sources. This wasn't about revenge. This was about protection. Over the next 2 days, while we continued our vigil in the NICU, I used every spare moment to build my case. When Sarah slept, I researched. When nurses came to check on our son, I took breaks and then returned to my phone. I contacted the City Housing Enforcement Department and asked about the process for reporting landlord violations and potential health hazards. I researched tenant rights organizations and found legal aid resources for people facing retaliatory evictions. I even looked into how to file tips with the IRS about suspected tax evasion, reading through their guidelines for reporting fraud and unreported income. Each step felt deliberate and necessary, like I was constructing a shield around my family one piece at a time. From that same plastic hospital chair where I had spent hours praying for my son's survival, I began filing formal complaints. I submitted detailed reports to the City Housing Enforcement Office, listing specific properties, violation codes, and safety concerns that had been ignored for years. I included dates, addresses, and references to existing complaint records that were already in the public system. I filed documentation with the Housing Authority explaining the timing of our eviction notice, how it had been delivered while our premature baby was in critical condition, and how Richard had disguised it inside a sympathy card. I described our phone conversation from 3 weeks earlier, his promise to be understanding, and the cruel betrayal of his actual actions. I also submitted information to the IRS regarding potential unreported rental income across multiple properties. I was careful to present only facts I could verify through public records. Properties with occupants but no reported rental income, suspicious discrepancies between market rates and declared earnings, patterns that suggested systematic underreporting. I didn't make accusations I couldn't support. I simply provided the information and let investigators decide whether it warranted further examination. Every form I filled out, every report I filed, every complaint I submitted was done carefully and correctly. I wanted no mistakes, no exaggerations, nothing that could be dismissed as emotional overreaction from a desperate tenant. Even after filing everything, life in the NICU remained painfully uncertain. The days continued to blur together in an endless cycle of hope and fear. Some mornings brought encouraging news from the doctors. Our son's oxygen levels were improving, he was gaining a few grams of weight, his breathing seemed slightly stronger. Other days brought setbacks. Infections, dropped oxygen saturation, moments when alarms screamed and nurses rushed in while Sarah and I held each other and tried not to fall apart completely. We learned to celebrate victories so small they would have seemed meaningless before. A successful feeding, a stable temperature, 12 hours without a major incident. But week by week, impossibly slowly, our son began to fight his way back to us. The ventilator settings were gradually reduced as his lungs grew stronger and learned to work on their own. Tubes started disappearing one by one, each removal marking a tiny milestone toward normalcy. His skin, which had been translucent and frighteningly fragile at first, began to look more like a regular baby's. Color returned to his cheeks. His movements became less jerky and more purposeful. The nurses started smiling more often when they checked on him, their expressions shifting from concern to cautiously optimistic. For the first time since the emergency delivery, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, we would actually get to take our son home. After 3.5 weeks in the NICU, the doctors finally said the words we had been desperately waiting to hear. Our son was ready to go home. He had reached the minimum weight threshold, he could breathe independently, he could regulate his own temperature, and he was feeding well enough to survive without medical intervention. I cannot fully describe what that moment felt like. Sarah cried so hard she couldn't speak, clutching our baby against her chest while I wrapped my arms around both of them. After all the fear, all the uncertainty, all the nights spent wondering if we would ever hear good news again, our son was coming home. He was alive. He was going to be okay. Around that same time, the complaints I had filed weeks earlier started producing real consequences for Richard Chin. City housing inspectors showed up at several of his properties and conducted thorough examinations that he couldn't avoid or delay. Violations that had been ignored for years were suddenly documented officially, complete with photographs, inspector notes, and mandatory compliance deadlines. Properties without proper certificates of occupancy were red-tagged, forcing Richard to either bring them up to code immediately or cease renting them out. Tenants who had been living in substandard conditions for years suddenly had official city backing for their complaints. The inspections triggered a cascade of legal and financial problems that Richard couldn't simply ignore or threaten away. The financial investigations took longer but eventually caught up with him too. The IRS doesn't move quickly, but when they do investigate, they investigate thoroughly. I never got official confirmation about what they found, but the results spoke for themselves. Liens started appearing on Richard's properties as fines accumulated and tax debts came due. Buildings that had been cash machines for years suddenly became liabilities, draining money instead of generating it. The pressure mounted from multiple directions at once. Code enforcement demanding expensive repairs, the housing authority reviewing his business practices, financial penalties piling up faster than he could pay them, and tenants who were no longer afraid to demand their legal rights. Our eviction notice was reviewed by a tenant rights organization that I had contacted while still in the hospital. They took one look at the timeline: premature baby in NICU, landlord informed of medical crisis, eviction notice delivered in a sympathy card during hospital stay, and immediately recognized it as a textbook case of retaliatory eviction. They helped us file a formal legal challenge, arguing that Richard had violated tenant protection laws by attempting to evict us specifically because we had fallen behind on rent due to a documented family emergency. The case was so clear-cut that Richard's own lawyer apparently advised him to withdraw the eviction rather than face a judge. The notice was officially ruled illegal and retaliatory. We were allowed to stay in our home for as long as we wanted, and Richard was barred from attempting another eviction without legitimate cause completely unrelated to our previous rent issues. The fear that had been crushing us for weeks finally lifted. We wouldn't lose our home. We wouldn't have to move our medically fragile newborn into a shelter or a car. We could focus entirely on our son's recovery without the constant terror of homelessness hanging over our heads. Richard never spoke to me again after that. No apology. No explanation. No acknowledgement of what he had done. Just complete silence. Over the following months, I watched Richard's small rental empire crumble piece by piece. 2 properties were sold quickly, apparently to cover mounting fines and legal fees. Another building was foreclosed on when he couldn't keep up with both the mortgage and the penalty payments. One property was seized by the city after repeated failures to address critical safety violations that posed immediate danger to tenants. The man who had hidden cruelty inside a baby card, who had tried to make us homeless while our son fought for his life, lost nearly everything because he had spent years cutting corners and exploiting vulnerable people. I didn't feel joy watching it happen. I felt something quieter. Justice. Now, 2 years later, I hold my healthy, curious son and watch him explore the world with the fearless enthusiasm that only toddlers possess. He runs, he laughs, he asks endless questions, and he has absolutely no idea how close he came to not surviving his first month of life. Sometimes I look at him playing with his toys and I still see that tiny 2-pound baby connected to tubes and wires, fighting for every breath. The memory of that hospital hallway still stings. I can still feel the weight of that card in my hands, still see the eviction notice falling out from between the cheerful teddy bears. But that memory no longer controls me. It no longer defines the worst moment of my life. What stays with me now is something stronger and more important than anger or pain. I learned that even in our most fragile moments, when everything feels hopeless and we seem completely powerless, we can still fight back. We can still stand up. We can still make cruel people answer for what they've done. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly with dramatic confrontations and immediate victories. Sometimes it comes quietly, through patience, documentation, and the steady accumulation of evidence that cannot be ignored or explained away. Sometimes the most powerful revenge is simply refusing to be destroyed, surviving when someone hoped you wouldn't, and watching their own actions collapse around them while you build your life back up, one day at a time, stronger than before.